Welcome to the deep dive. You're here because you want to understand the world, and, well, you want to understand it now.
Exactly.
Today, we're tackling a really big one, how the world tries, to keep the peace.
Hmm.
We're digging deep into the mechanisms for preventing, managing, and resolving international conflicts and disputes. The United Nations and its charter are going to be pretty central here.
Absolutely. For this deep dive, we've looked at, well, a really wide range of sources. The UN Charter itself, of course,
Yeah.
but also lots of real-world examples, analyses of interventions.
It's quite the stack of material.
It is. Our mission, essentially, is to give you a clear picture. What are the key tools, the strategies available to stop conflicts, ideally before they even start?
And what happens if prevention doesn't quite cut it?
Right. Think of this as your rapid access guide to understanding how global peacemaking is supposed to work.
Okay, let's unpack this. Global conflict. It can feel just overwhelming, can't it?
It really can.
But our sources suggest it's maybe better to think of it as a process with different stages.
That's a good way to put it. This global approach looks at conflict across its life cycle, you could say, and the approach needs to adapt at each stage.
So, right at the beginning, the pre-conflict phase, Chapter 6 of the UN Charter comes up a lot. What's the main idea there?
The core of Chapter 6 is its focus on the peaceful settlement of disputes.
Yeah.
It's really the UN's primary toolkit before things turn violent.
Laying out tools like diplomacy, peacemaking.
Exactly. Diplomacy, peacemaking, even longer-term peace-building concepts are rooted there. It's about de-escalation.
And central to this is conflict prevention. What does that look like, practically speaking?
Well, in its most direct sense, conflict prevention means short-term actions. Things you do to reduce immediate tensions, to stop actors, whether internal or external, from resorting to force.
Stepping in early.
Precisely. Stopping things from boiling over.
One tool here that sounds quite intriguing is early warning. It almost sounds military.
And it did start there. Originally, it was about detecting troop movements, signs of attack, that sort of thing.
Right.
But the really interesting part is how it evolved. It moved into civilian uses.
How so?
For example, monitoring things like food consumption patterns or sudden price spikes. They can give you an early warning of potential famine or related instability. It's about spotting signals before the full-blown crisis.
From watching troops to watching grain prices, that's quite a leap.
It is. And after the Cold War, you saw international organizations really leaning into this.
Like the OSCE, the OAU.
Exactly. The OSCE, the OAU, which is now the African Union, of course, USA side, the EU, they all started developing their own early warning systems, even with, pretty limited means back in the 90s.
And the UN itself?
The UN had early efforts, too. In the Horn of Africa in the 80s, working with the FAO and IGADD. Eventually, this led to setting up a UN liaison office at the OAU in 1998. It showed a real commitment to getting those early signals, to collaborating.
Beyond those immediate triggers, the sources talk about latent conflict. What are we talking about there?
Latent conflict refers to those deeper issues, the underlying tensions, the potential sources of violence that haven't erupted yet but could.
Like embers.
Exactly like embers, smoldering away. Identifying those and finding ways to sort of deactivate them is key for long-term prevention.
There was a commission, the Carnish Commission, that tried to categorize prevention strategies.
Yes, they made a useful distinction. I talked about operational prevention and structural prevention.
Okay, what's the difference?
Operational prevention is about the short-term stuff. Immediate measures for immediate crises, sending in mediators quickly, that kind of thing.
Firefighting.
Right. Whereas structural prevention is the long game. It's about addressing the root causes to prevent crises from arising in the first place or from recurring.
Like investing in development.
Precisely. Investing in development, education, strengthening institutions, building a more stable foundation so the fires are less likely to start.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, Article 33 of Chapter 6, you mentioned it lists specific tools. What are the key ones?
Article 33 is really the heart of Chapter 6 Peaceful Settlement Toolkit. It lists things like negotiation, inquiry, mediation, conciliation, arbitration, judicial settlement,
A whole menu of options.
and also resorting to regional agencies. It encourages parties to choose some peaceful means.
And the Security Council, how does it fit in at this early stage? We usually think of it having the real teeth.
It has a crucial role. The Council can urge the parties to use these Article 33 methods to find a peaceful way forward.
Anyone can bring a dispute to the Council, even non-members.
Yes, interestingly, any state can raise an issue. But if you're not a UN member, there's a condition.
Which is?
You have to accept the obligations of peaceful settlement under the Charter and agree to abide by the Council's eventual decision on the matter.
Seems
Yeah.
fair. What about the General Assembly? How does it relate to the Security Council here? Is there overlap?
There's a defined relationship, mainly in Articles 10 and 12. Basically, the General Assembly shouldn't make recommendations on a dispute or situation while the Security Council is actively exercising its functions regarding it.
Unless the Council asks.
Unless the Council asks, exactly. But the General Assembly can still discuss these issues, and, importantly, it can bring situations that might endanger international peace and security to the Council's attention. It can sound the alarm.
So it has a role in flagging dangers.
Yes. And Article 14 gives the General Assembly quite broad scope, too.
How so?
It allows the Assembly to recommend measures for the peaceful adjustment of any situation, regardless of origin, which it thinks could harm general welfare or friendly relations between nations. It's a fairly wide mandate for promoting peace.
Okay, so both the Council and the Assembly can recommend these Article 33 tools. But initially, it's just recommending. They can't force parties to, say, mediate.
That's right. Under Chapter 6, their primary power is persuasion and recommendation. However, if the Security Council determines that a situation actually constitutes a threat to international peace and security,
And things change.
then things change. The Council can then make binding decisions, potentially including measures that involve force, but that moves us towards Chapter 7 territory.
Ah, okay. And there's that Uniting for Peace resolution from 1950. That sounds like a workaround for a Security Council deadlock.
It is, essentially. It was created during the Korean War. It allows the General Assembly to step in and make recommendations, including potentially for collective measures, if the Security Council is paralyzed by a lack of unanimity among its permanent members, the veto, basically.
A sort of safety valve.
A safety valve, yes.
We've also seen the Security Council pass some very powerful resolutions, like 1373 on counterterrorism, 1540 on nuclear proliferation. How do they fit in?
Those are strong examples of the Council acting under its Chapter 7 powers. When there's political will and consensus among the permanent members, the Council can take significant binding action to address what it identifies as clear threats to international peace and security, going well beyond mere recommendations.
Okay, let's shift focus slightly to the UN Secretary General. They have a role too, right? Even with maybe fewer formal powers.
Absolutely. The Secretary General's role is often exercised through good offices and mediation. They act as a trusted, impartial third party.
A go-between.
A go-between, or sometimes actively proposing solutions to help parties reach an agreement. It's a vital diplomatic function. The Security Council recognized this back in 2000, asking the SG for a specific report on conflict prevention.
And we saw Ban Ki-moon's work in Sudan as an example.
Yes, his efforts in Darfur illustrate this. He engaged in delicate diplomacy, persuading the Council on sanctions while negotiating with Khartoum to allow a larger UN peacekeeping presence, and eventually the joint AU-UN operation. It showed the SG's potential influence.
Preventative diplomacy is another term that comes up a lot. What does that mean in practice?
Preventive diplomacy is really a broad umbrella term. It covers measures to stop disputes from arising in the first place, to prevent existing ones from escalating into violence, and to limit the spread of conflicts if they do occur.
Practiced by diplomats, heads of state.
Yes, across various international organizations. And it has sort of two sides to it. There's the short-term aspect, directly influencing potential conflict actors right before violence might break out. And then there's the long-term view, addressing underlying issues in societies not currently at war to prevent future conflict. Structural work.
The sources give some really big historical examples of that long-term, structural kind. The Marshall Plan, the European communities.
Those are fascinating examples. The Marshall Plan wasn't just about rebuilding. It fostered economic interdependence, tying former adversaries together. Jean Monnet and others saw European integration explicitly as a peace project.
Making war less likely, even unthinkable.
That was the vision. And the Cold War, paradoxically, probably strengthened the appeal of Western European integration.
And the other example was the Conference for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the CSCEOSCE.
Right. Launched in 1972, it made surprising progress on confidence-building measures between East and West, even during the Cold War. It helped, manage and eventually transform that relationship when many were skeptical.
Compared to those huge structural efforts, it seems the UN's own preventative diplomacy successes often rely more on that discreet, Secretary General-led diplomacy. Good offices.
That's often been the case, yes. Those quiet, behind-the-scenes efforts.
Like Trig Vlai and the Berlin crisis.
Exactly. In 1949, Lai facilitated talks that helped lift the blockade. Daghammer Skjold's work in '55 with the U.S. and China over captured airmen is another example.
And U Thant during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Crucial. His interventions are widely credited with helping find a path away from the brink in 1962.
And we shouldn't forget Article 99 of the Charter. The SG can bring threats to the Security Council's attention.
A very important, though rarely used, power. The Secretary General invoking it recently in December 2023 regarding the Israel-Hamas war was a significant moment, bringing that situation formally to the Council's agenda under that specific article.
And the UN leadership has repeatedly asked the SG to focus on prevention, like that 2001 report request.
Yes, it shows the ongoing institutional emphasis on trying to get ahead of conflicts.
Okay, so after the Cold War, this focus intensified, linking early warning with early action. How do they connect?
They're two sides of the same coin, really. Early warning is identifying the potential crisis. Early action is the response, the preventive diplomatic steps, the political side of prevention.
Addressing root causes.
Ideally, yes. The key idea is an integrated approach, combining preventative development aid with proactive diplomacy. Just having the warning signal isn't enough. You need the political will and the mechanisms to act on it.
The UK's conflict prevention strategy review around 2000 sounds like a good example of trying to integrate this.
It was. It involved coordinating efforts across different government departments, defense, finance, foreign affairs, development. They set up specific regional conflict prevention pools. It was a serious attempt to link security with development and human rights.
And there's that growing focus on security sector reform, ensuring civilian control.
Absolutely. The thinking is that a well-governed, accountable security sector under civilian oversight is much less likely to be a source of conflict and more likely to support stability and development. Organizations like the OECD's Development Assistance Committee also push this multi-sectoral view.
Let's look at some specific early action measures. Sanctions come up a lot. What kinds are there?
Sanctions are a varied toolkit. You have political or diplomatic ones like sports bans, visa denials, reducing diplomatic staff, arms embargoes.
Like the bans on apartheid South Africa.
Exactly. Then there are commercial sanctions, hitting trade. These are often controversial because they can hurt the general population.
Right.
More targeted are financial sanctions, aimed at specific leaders, elites, or entities, trying to put pressure on the decision makers.
The UN sanctions on Libya under Gaddafi are mentioned. What's the lesson there?
That was a long-running case, 92 to 2003. The key thing initially was that the sanctions, aimed at forcing accountability for terrorism, specifically excluded oil exports for a time. It showed an attempt, however debated, to target the regime without crippling the entire economy immediately.
Another tool is making development aid conditional, using aid as leverage.
Essentially, yes. Linking aid to things like human rights improvements or democratic reforms.
Brave.
But it's a bit tricky.
Why is that?
Well, there aren't globally agreed criteria, which makes it inconsistent. And in states that are already fragile or collapsing, withholding aid might actually worsen the humanitarian situation or even fuel conflict. It can be a blunt instrument.
The sources also mention other, sometimes more controversial early measures, military interventions in the 90s.
Yes, things like the interventions in Iraq post-Gulf War, the U.S. in Somalia in '93, France's Operation Turquoise in Rwanda, even the long-standing demilitarized zone in Korea. These are cited as types of early action, though the justification and effectiveness are often heavily debated.
The Rwanda example seems particularly stark in highlighting the potential value of prevention.
It really is. The Carnegie Commission estimated that a relatively modest preventive deployment of UN troops in early '94, plus other measures, might have averted the genocide. The potential cost of that prevention was tiny compared to the eventual human tragedy and the massive costs of intervention and recovery afterwards.
A sobering calculation.
It underscores that while prevention isn't foolproof, some things like the Falklands Malvinas invasion or Kuwait might be hard to foresee. The potential payoff for successful early action is immense.
Okay, so let's move on. When prevention isn't enough and disputes escalate, we get to the peaceful settlement of disputes under Article 33. President Roosevelt had a vision here, didn't he?
He did. He saw the UN not just as a way to stop wars once they started, but fundamentally to stop the beginnings of wars, to address the situations that linger conflict.
And Article 33 lists the methods. Can we categorize them?
Yes, Article 33 gives that list. Negotiation, inquiry, mediation, conciliation, arbitration, judicial settlement using regional agencies, or any other peaceful means the parties choose. The Security Council can also call on parties to use these methods. Broadly, you can group them into political means and judicial or jurisdictional means.
Let's take the political means first. Negotiation, the oldest one.
Definitely the oldest. It's just the parties talking directly through representatives trying to find a solution. Good faith is key. And if it fails, the charter implies an obligation to try other means.
We see big international conferences for negotiation.
Yes, things like the Dayton talks for the Balkans, Asian regional meetings, the Madrid process for the Middle East, the EU Central America dialogue. These are all platforms for negotiation.
And there's this distinction between first track and second track diplomacy.
Right. First track is the official government-to-government level. Second track, or sometimes multi-track, is becoming increasingly important. It involves informal, non-official meetings.
Bringing in NGOs, academics.
Exactly. NGOs, academics, religious figures, former officials, people who can talk more freely, build trust, explore options outside the formal glare.
Are there specific examples of second track initiatives?
Oh, yes. Groups like International Alert in London, the Institute for Multi-Track Diplomacy in D.C., Susan Shirk's Northeast Asia Cooperation Dialogue, the community of Sant'Egidio, which has done amazing work in Mozambique and Burundi. They play a vital, often unseen role.
Okay. Then there's inquiry determining facts. How does that work?
Inquiry is usually requested by the parties. They agree to cooperate with the commission to clarify the facts of the dispute. The commission investigates, gathers information, but crucially, it doesn't propose a solution.
Just establishes the facts.
Right. It clears the ground, hopefully making a resolution easier to find based on a shared understanding of what actually happened.
Next is good offices. Sounds like being a helpful intermediary.
That's essentially it. It happens before mediation usually. A neutral third party, a state, a prominent person, a UN body acts as a channel of communication.
Just connecting the parties.
Yes, trying to get them to start talking directly, or resume talks if they've broken down. The provider of good offices doesn't get involved in the substance, doesn't propose solutions.
Can they offer, or do they have to be asked?
They can offer, but the parties have to accept. It can be rejected. And sometimes good offices naturally evolve into mediation. The line can blur. Theodore Roosevelt helping Russia and Japan talk in 1905 is a classic example.
Okay, so mediation is the next step up, where the third party gets more involved.
Exactly. In mediation, the mediator actively tries to broker an agreement and usually does propose solutions. They take a position on the substance.
Examples.
Historical ones include Pope Leo III between Spain and Germany in the 1880s over Pacific Islands, or Pope John Paul II helping Argentina and Chile resolve the Beagle Channel dispute in the 1980s after earlier Vatican mediation helped prevent war.
So the mediator suggests a deal.
Yes, based on their assessment. But again, the parties are free to accept or reject the mediator's involvement and their proposed solution. Norway's role leading to the Oslo Accords in 1993 is a famous modern example of successful mediation.
The role of regional organizations seems key here, too.
Increasingly so. They often have better local knowledge, more trust, and provide forums for neighbors to tackle cross-border issues. Chapter 8 of the UN Charter provides the legal basis for their cooperation with the UN.
And the UN works with them?
Yes, there are regular meetings.
Oh.
A UN liaison office was set up at the OAU back in '98. There are annual meetings in Geneva involving the UN, EU, OSCE, Council of Europe, specifically on conflict prevention.
And these organizations have their own mechanisms.
Many do. The OSCE has its Center for Conflict Prevention. The EU has a specific program. The African Union inherited and developed the OAU's Mechanism for Prevention, Management, and Resolution of Conflicts. ECOWAS in West Africa has one. The OAS focuses a lot on promoting democracy.
The African mechanism has evolved quite a bit.
Yes, significantly from the OAU days through various summits leading to the AU's Peace and Security Council, a much stronger setup now.
What about commissions of inquiry? Are they different from the fact-finding inquiry?
They often serve a similar fact-finding purpose, but can sometimes have a broader mandate, perhaps looking into human rights violations or specific events. Examples include those by the OSCE High Commissioner on National Minorities, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, or those in Rwanda supported by NGOs.
And confidence-building measures, what are those?
Often military-related, things like notifications of troop movements, observer exchanges, establishing regional risk reduction centers designed to increase transparency and reduce mistrust between potential adversaries.
And institutional strengthening.
That's about building capacity within a state to manage its own affairs peacefully, supporting judicial reform, administrative capacity, like the help given to Haiti after democracy was restored.
Finally, under political means, the role of NGOs. Article 71 of the Charter even mentions them.
Yes, NGOs are crucial. They offer nonviolent solutions, facilitate that vital second-track diplomacy, conduct early warning studies, raise international awareness, shape public opinion. Think of their role in the treaty banning landmines. A huge impact.
Okay, that covers the political means. Now, the jurisdictional means. Arbitration, judicial settlement, and conciliation. Arbitration has a long history.
It does. Codified back at the Hague Peace Conferences in 1899 and 1907. Got another boost after World War I with things like the Locarno treaties.
How does it work?
Parties in dispute agree to submit their case to a neutral third party, an arbitrator or a panel, whose decision, the award, or laudo, will be legally binding.
Who uses it?
Typically, states or intergovernmental organizations,
Yeah.
subjects of international law. They choose the arbitrator, present their case, and the award has the force of res judicata. It settles the matter legally.
The sources mention litigations versus conflicts. What's that distinction?
Litigation here refers specifically to a legal dispute about rights. Arbitration is well suited for those. Think of border disputes or maritime delimitations like the Libya-Tunisia and Libya-Malta cases in the 80s over the continental shelf. A conflict can be broader, more political, not necessarily reducible to a legal question.
And arbitration is listed in Article 33. If parties agree to it, or to judicial settlement, they have to accept the outcome.
Yes, that's the core principle. The obligation is to accept the ruling. Both processes rely on principles of law and equity, often drawing on Article 38 of the ICJ statute.
Okay, then conciliation. How is that different?
Conciliation is a bit newer, emerging more with the League of Nations. A commission, which can include nationals from the disputing states, investigates the dispute, but only makes non-binding suggestions for a solution.
So it's a recommendation, not a ruling.
Exactly. The parties aren't legally bound to accept the conciliator's proposals. It's more about facilitating a settlement through expert, impartial suggestions based on law. It's worth remembering the League tried hard to advance judicial methods, even proposing compulsory jurisdiction for the Permanent Court of International Justice, though that didn't fully fly. The UN inherited these tools.
And finally, judicial settlement. This means the International Court of Justice.
Primarily, yes. The ICJ, the UN's principal judicial organ. Article 2, paragraph 4 of the Charter is fundamental here, condemning force, mandating peaceful settlement. That was revolutionary, universally outlawing war for the first time.
And Articles 33, 37 list the tools.
Right. Negotiation, good offices, arbitration, judicial settlement, regional agencies. But crucially, the choice of means rests with the states themselves. State sovereignty is key, unlike some League ideas. Force is only legitimate under the Charter and Self-Defense, Article 51.
UN Resolution 2625 from 1970 is also mentioned.
Yes, that resolution reaffirmed the peaceful settlement obligation and also, importantly, added the right to self-determination to the mix.
The sources distinguish between a situation and a controversy. Why is that important for UN action?
It relates to how the Security Council might engage. A situation is more general, a potential source of friction, maybe latent. The Council might discuss it, but often respects internal sovereignty. A controversy is a specific, active disagreement between states where the Council is more likely to step in using Chapter 6 mechanisms.
The Second Gulf War in 91 is mentioned as reflecting a change.
Yes, happening right at the end of the Cold War, the strong Security Council response to Iraq's invasion of Kuwait signaled a potentially more assertive UN. This context heavily influenced Boutros-Ghali's 1992 An Agenda for Peace, which really laid out these concepts we're discussing: preventive diplomacy, peacemaking, peacekeeping, peace-building, even peace enforcement.
Which brings us to peace operations, a
Yeah.
broad term.
Very broad. Developed by the UN, adopted by others. Peacekeeping itself emerged as a practical UN invention, not explicitly in the 1945 Charter, to contain and manage disputes. The UN sees it as helping conflict-torn countries create conditions for sustainable peace.
Okay, we've covered a lot on prevention and peaceful settlement. Now, let's turn to what happens when conflict is actually underway or just ended: management and resolution. This brings us more towards Chapter 5 of the Charter.
Yes, Chapter 5 deals with the Security Council, but the actions often draw authority from Chapters 6 and 7, which cover peaceful settlement and action regarding threats to peace, breaches of peace, and aggression. Maintaining international peace and security is the UN's primary goal, stated right at the beginning.
But as you said, peace operations aren't explicitly defined in the Charter.
No, the concepts and practices have evolved over time, based on the foundations laid in Chapters 6 and 7.
There's also this tension mentioned: the principle of non-intervention in Article 2.7 versus the need to act.
That's a constant challenge. Respecting state sovereignty is fundamental, but it complicates efforts to intervene, even when there are clear risks of mass atrocities or regional instability. It's a difficult balance.
So once conflict starts, we talk about conflict management. What's the aim there?
Conflict management is about preventing an ongoing violent conflict from getting worse, from intensifying or spreading, trying to reduce its harm, its duration. Crisis management became a popular term for this after the Cold War.
The sources describe an escalation phase. What's happening then?
That's when parties are moving towards confrontation. Violence might be sporadic or threatened, but not yet widespread. It's a crucial moment where peace-building or consolidation efforts might still halt the slide into full-scale war.
But these phases aren't always neat and tidy in reality.
Not at all. The lines are often blurred. Pre-conflict, escalation, conflict, post-conflict. They can overlap. Missions often need to adapt and perform different functions simultaneously or sequentially.
Let's clarify those key terms. Peacekeeping, peacemaking, peace building.
Okay, so passive peacekeeping is often about monitoring ceasefires, keeping forces separated after an agreement. Active peacemaking is more about the diplomatic effort to reach a definitive settlement, sometimes using pressure like sanctions.
And peace building.
Peace building, or peace consolidation, is the longer-term effort to solidify peace after the violence stops. It addresses root causes. It includes nation building, fostering a shared identity, reconciliation, and state building, reconstructing effective, legitimate government institutions.
So each mission type fits a different stage or need. And the growth in these operations suggests a belief that peaceful resolution is possible.
I think so. The sheer number and evolution of peace operations show the international community, despite failures, investing heavily in the idea that conflicts can be managed and resolved peacefully at any stage.
Let's look closer at peacemaking first. What does that involve?
Once conflict erupts, peacemaking is about trying to reach agreements, usually through peaceful means under Chapter 6, diplomatic efforts, ministerial meetings, envoys, NGO diplomacy, think tank advice, all aimed at getting the parties to agree to stop fighting and resolve their issues. Though, theoretically, it could involve peace enforcement under Chapter 7 if peaceful means fail.
Then, after an agreement, comes peacekeeping.
Typically, yes. If an agreement is reached and violence subsides, peacekeeping forces might deploy to maintain the ceasefire, build confidence. This then creates space for peace consolidation or peace building.
Peace building sounds like the really deep long-term work.
It is. Boutros Ghali defined it as post-conflict action to strengthen and solidify peace. It's about rebuilding societies politically, socioeconomically, increasingly militarily, and humanitarily too.
What kinds of activities fall under peace building?
A huge range. Conflict prevention elements, early warning, continued diplomacy, post-conflict reconstruction, implementing the peace deal, disarmament and demobilization of fighters, DDR, security sector reform, protecting civilians, rebuilding the economy, legal systems, administration.
And military and humanitarian aspects.
Rebuilding state institutions, especially in fragile or failed states, reforming security forces, training police, providing humanitarian aid, strengthening the rule of law. It's incredibly broad.
It's interesting that the League of Nations did some similar things.
Yes. Administering the Saar and Danzig refugee work, minority protection. It shows this evolution from just watching to intervening and increasingly focusing on that post-conflict phase, reconstruction aid, human rights.
A shift from limited intervention to something more comprehensive.
Definitely. Especially noticeable in places like the Western Balkans, from just monitoring to long-term, deep involvement in rebuilding states.
Civilian police seem increasingly important in these operations.
Hugely important, especially in post-Cold War civil conflicts. They have a preventative role, restoring public trust in law enforcement, training local police, monitoring human rights, helping restructure the whole institution, building rule of law from the ground up.
And DDR disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration seems critical.
Absolutely essential for stability. Getting weapons out of circulation, helping former fighters find a new life. It's usually part of a wider peace package, including justice reform, security reform, maybe elections.
But the timing of elections matters.
Critically. Holding them too early, before stability takes fruit and civil society recovers, can actually make things worse. Some argue Libya after 2011 is an example. We need to get the sequencing right.
Disarmament, collecting weapons, how does that work?
It's the collection, control, often destruction of weapons, especially small arms. Usually happens alongside other peace efforts. Arms embargoes are the related sanction. The UN has registers for transparency on arms transfers and military spending, too.
What's this Weapons for Development program?
That's a UNDP initiative, supported by the UN Disarmament Department, basically offering communities development aid in return for handing in illicit weapons. Had some success in Albania after the '97 chaos, for instance.
But not a full DDR program.
No, full DDR is more structured, usually post-conflict, involving multiple agencies like the World Bank for funding, the World Food Program for food aid during transition.
The WFP's role sounds significant.
Very. They've collaborated on UN-supported DDR in many countries since the '90s: Namibia, Angola, Mozambique, Liberia, Sierra Leone, providing that crucial safety net. Lessons from Liberia and Sierra Leone showed that underfunding DDR can lead to relapse into violence. Successful programs in Guatemala, Mozambique, and elsewhere highlight the need for proper resources.
Okay, let's focus specifically on peacekeeping operations now. The Blue Helmets. How are they defined?
Peacekeeping is the deployment of UN military contingents, mandated by the Security Council under Article 24 to preserve a peace that's already been agreed.
What do they do on the ground?
The Security Council sets the tasks. It can be monitoring ceasefires, separating forces, creating buffer zones, helping distribute aid, protecting civilians, supervising elections, demining, overseeing disarmament, supporting economic reconstruction, a wide range of tasks depending on the mandate.
We have some very long-running missions.
Yes, UNTSO in Palestine from 1948 was the pioneer, UN MOJIP in India-Pakistan from 1949, and UNFICYP in Cyprus from 1964 are the oldest still active. UNTSO started with just 36 observers, the first Blue Helmets, verifying armistices.
And the core principles of peacekeeping.
3 key ones: consent to the main parties, impartiality in carrying out the mandate, and non-use of force, except in self-defense and defense of the mandate. These are crucial for legitimacy.
The Suez Crisis Mission, UNIFI, in 1956 seems like a landmark.
It really was the first major military peacekeeping force, deployed to supervise troop withdrawal and monitor the Egypt-Israel border, crucially with Egyptian consent, operated under Chapter 6 principles. It became the model for the first generation of peacekeeping.
Later missions like Congo, ONUC, were more complex.
Much more. ONUC deployed in 1960 after independence, at Congo's request, amid chaos and Belgian intervention. Had a complex mandate: maintain independence, provide technical aid, support territorial integrity against Katanga secession. UNIFIL in Lebanon from '78 is also part of this generation.
What defined this first generation legally?
Autonomy of the operation, respect for host state autonomy, and non-use of force except self-defense. The Cold War really limited the number of these missions because of superpower rivalry in the Security Council.
Then came a second generation in the 1980s. How was it different?
Several ways. Permanent Security Council members usually didn't contribute troops. Consent was needed from the parties and the superpowers. The goal was often just to freeze the conflict, an emergency measure, not necessarily a definitive settlement.
What enabled this shift?
The easing of Cold War tensions mid-decade. These missions often involved implementing actual peace agreements, usually after interstate wars. They had larger civilian components, dealing with human rights, civil administration, post-conflict peace building. UNAVIM in Angola from '88 is an example. Complex, overlapping activities.
And then the end of the Cold War opened the floodgates.
Completely. Superpower constraints vanished. But what emerged was a surge of messy intrastate conflicts, civil wars, ethnic strife, failed states. The UN saw an explosion in demand for operations from about 10 missions total between '48 and '88 to 36 just in the next decade, '88 to '98, and they were far more complex.
Boutros Ghali's agenda for democratization in '95 reflected this changing landscape.
Yes, building on his '92 agenda for peace, a growing recognition that democracy and human rights were central to resolving these internal conflicts.
This led to the third generation of peace operations, responding to these complex crises.
Exactly. Driven by conflicts causing huge humanitarian disasters. Ideas about sovereignty started shifting, especially when states committed massive human rights violations or conflicts spilled across borders, like Rwanda or Liberia.
The Second Gulf War in '91 fits in here.
It was a precursor, in a way. Not peacekeeping, but the strong Security Council authorization for intervention against Iraq showed a more assertive UN, even as the Soviet Union was collapsing. Signal to change.
So between '91 and '94, peacekeeping expanded rapidly.
Dramatically.
Yeah.
The UN tried to respond everywhere, but often lacked the resources, the doctrine, the capacity for these incredibly complex internal conflicts. It was during this time Boutros Ghali redefined peace operations into those 4 areas: preventive diplomacy, peacekeeping, peacemaking, peacebuilding, expanding the UN's ambition. The War Crimes Tribunals for Yugoslavia and Rwanda and the ICC also came out of this era's focus on justice and impunity.
Let's clarify the jump from Chapter 6 to Chapter 7 in the Charter for these operations.
Okay. Chapter 7 is where peace enforcement lives. While the Charter prohibits force generally, Chapter 7 allows it if the Security Council determines a threat to international peace, a breach of peace, or aggression exists. Article 39.
What measures can the Council take then?
Articles 41 and 42 lay them out. Article 41 covers measures not involving armed force, economic sanctions, cutting communications, breaking diplomatic ties. Article 42 allows for military action if Article 41 measures are inadequate.
Like the Korean War intervention.
That was an early, clear Chapter 7 enforcement action. The Suez Mission, UNEF-1, in '56, however, led to peacekeeping. Secretary General Hammarskjöld coined the term Chapter 6.5 for peacekeeping,
Why 6.5?
to place it somewhere between the purely consensual Chapter 6 and the coercive Chapter 7. It acknowledged peacekeeping used military personnel but relied on consent and wasn't enforcement. Helped avoid potential vetoes. There's still debate on where peacekeeping truly fits.
So peacekeeping needs that prior agreement and consent.
Generally, yes. The conflict parties accept the mission. Mostly military historically, but now, as we said, lots of civilian and police components too. The main goal is supervising the agreement, verifying ceasefires, ensuring aid delivery.
And peacebuilding follows that.
Ideally, post-conflict actions to reinforce peace, build trust, tackle root causes, long-term work, training security forces, supporting institutions, helping refugees, elections, demining, all targeting the structural drivers of conflict.
The interventions in the Balkans, Iraq, Afghanistan taught some hard lessons about peacebuilding.
They did. A key lesson was that international efforts often focus more on international legitimacy than on building national legitimacy and local ownership.
What's meant by nation building in this context?
It's been used differently over time. After WWI, during decolonization, more recently, in post-conflict situations, it's sometimes seen as trying to rebuild societies, often mixing idealism with the strategic interests of the interveners. Afghanistan post-2001 is a prime example of a long, complex, ultimately frustrating nation-building effort.
Let's quickly recap peacemaking and peace enforcement again.
Peacemaking. Diplomatic actions under Chapter 6. Getting parties to negotiate. Using the ICJ, mediation, etc. Can include sanctions, applying pressure, maybe before using force. Sanctions can escalate from targeted measures to full embargoes or diplomatic breaks. Peace enforcement. Coercive measures under Chapter 7. Used when peaceful means fail and the Security Council determines a threat to peace exists. Involves military force or other mandatory measures.
And these distinctions became clearer after the Cold War.
Much clearer, really from '92 onwards. The complexity of the new conflicts demanded it. Needed more actors, civilians, NGOs for peacemaking and peacebuilding, moved beyond just freezing conflicts to aiming for real resolution. Boutros-Ghali's '92 Agenda for Peace was pivotal in framing this. The General Assembly also got heavily involved in debates about UN reform.
The UN's experiences in the Balkans, Somalia, Rwanda were particularly difficult learning moments.
Hugely difficult. The Balkans was a complex laboratory with UN, NATO, EU, OSCE all present. Somalia was a major setback. Srebrenica in '95, where Dutch peacekeepers couldn't prevent the massacre. A terrible failure that led to the Dutch government resigning years later after an inquiry.
And other tragedies.
The attack on the UN in Baghdad in 2003, killing Sergio Vieira de Mello. Clashes in Haiti. These events exposed the immense dangers and shortcomings.
Which led to the Brahimi Report in 2000, a critical self-assessment.
Exactly. Kofi Annan commissioned it precisely because of those major failures in the '90s, Balkans, Somalia, Rwanda, while also acknowledging successes elsewhere like El Salvador or Cambodia. The panel, led by Lakhdar Brahimi, aimed to draw lessons.
What were the key takeaways from Brahimi?
Several crucial points. One, UN troops needed to be better equipped, trained, and crucially, have mandates and rules of engagement allowing them to credibly defend themselves and their mandate. A direct lesson from Srebrenica.
Better resources and clearer mandates.
Yes. More personnel, standby forces, better logistics. The UN standby arrangement system came out of this.
Yeah.
And a huge emphasis on needing realistic, achievable mandates suited to the actual situation on the ground, not based on flimsy peace agreements. Don't deploy if there's no real peace to keep.
What about working with regional organizations?
Brahimi stressed a better division of labor and partnerships. praised eco-West-Camog efforts in West Africa. This led to things like the G8 commitments to help build the African Union's peace support capacity,
And the role of police and civilians.
officially recognized their growing importance. Emphasized DDR again. The acronym SMART Support, Monitor, Advise, Report, Train emerged for police roles, though executive policing, like in Kosovo or East Timor, remained challenging. It also noted the value of gendarmerie-type forces, like Guardia Civil, Carabinieri, who bridge military and police cultures.
Finally, the sources mention Article 51, self-defense, and organizations like NATO, the EU, AU, OSCE.
Right. Article 51 allows for collective self-defense, underpinning organizations like NATO, the EU, and the AU, which have multinational force capabilities. Chapter 8 allows regional bodies to deal with peace and security if consistent with UN principles. The OSCE focuses more on preventive diplomacy, fact-finding, like the High Commissioner on National Minorities or the Minsk Group for Nagorno-Karabakh. They all fit into this complex web.
Wow. We have definitely covered a huge amount of ground, a real deep dive into this complex world.
We certainly have. It shows the UN and the international community have built up this, well, comprehensive toolkit. Complex, constantly evolving, but comprehensive.
We've really unpacked the differences between prevention before conflict, management during, and resolution and peace building after, and all the different tools, political, jurisdictional.
And highlighted the roles of everyone involved. The Security Council, General Assembly, the Secretary General, regional bodies, even NGOs. It's a collective effort, at least in theory.
But it's also clear there are major challenges, limitations. Things still go wrong, failures happen, which forces constant learning, like the Brahimi report showed.
Absolutely. Which leads us, I suppose, to a final thought for you, our listener. Thinking about everything we've discussed, all these mechanisms, tools, approaches,
Yeah.
what do you see as the single biggest obstacle to achieving more lasting peace in the world today?
And maybe just as importantly, what role can our own individual understanding, our engagement with these issues, play in helping to overcome that obstacle? Something to ponder.